With the college football regular season at an end, I thought it would be fun to take a look back and rank every single week during the regular season. I still think it is easily the best part of college football. It's what makes it stand apart. There is nothing that beats the feeling of looking at your TV or looking down at your phone on a Saturday morning and realizing, wow, we've got like literally 50 plus college football games today that you can go through and you can watch. And it's just a thing of beauty. And I still value it over anything. You could take the greatest national championship game of all time. I would take just a Saturday in the fall when college football is on. So let's get into it. Let's go ahead and rank every week of the season. There were 15 of them this year. And let's start with number 15. Coming in at number 15, we have Week 0. This one, until further notice, will always be in last place on this list, and I like Week 0 for what it is. It's just a small little appetizer that allows us for some fun shenanigans, like an additional home Hawaii game, a game in a neutral site overseas, like in Dublin. That's pretty fun, and so I'm glad that this week exists, and this year it was pretty entertaining. All four of these games were really close. We saw a top 10 upset, Georgia Tech over Florida State, no matter how that one ended up aging, and some really fun, close games. And this weekend actually ended up featuring a playoff team, but it was SMU and not Florida State. So overall, a really solid Week 0, but still takes the last place spot on this list. Coming in at number 14, we have Week 1. Week 1 of the season is obviously awesome because it's the first full slate of college football we get, but it really lacked depth this year. There were a lot of FCS games in this first week, but we still had a few marquee matchups, and on paper, this week looked pretty good because of the top-tier cream of the crop games, the Georgia-Clemson game, the Notre Dame A&M game, the LSU-USC game in Vegas, but those marquee matchups were mostly one-sided. The only ones that were really close and down to the wire was like the USC-LSU game came down to it. Notre Dame, Texas A&M was at least close in the second half. We saw Colorado, North Dakota State deliver a nice one. But in terms of the blowouts, there were a couple, including the marquee game in Georgia-Clemson. So overall, this week falls a little bit short because of those shortcomings. Coming in at number 13, we have Week 3. Week 3 has some of the same pitfalls that Week 1 had, which is a lot of FCS games still. We're still not quite into conference play. And there was a handful of surprises, even some instant classics, like LSU South Carolina, I'd argue, was a really, really awesome game. Georgia Kentucky was quite surprising as well. Really, the thing that separates Week 3 from Week 1, in my opinion, is just the surplus of rivalry games that we ended up getting this week. It's not exactly by design, but with all of the realignment and teams from different conferences playing each other now in rivalry games, we were able to actually get a decent handful of such games, the Apple Cup, the Civil War, the Backyard Brawl, and so it results in a pleasant Week 3 where you've got some fun rivalries. Coming in at number 12, we have Week 9. Week 9 had a redeeming quality of having the best Group of 5 matchup of the season, Boise State versus UNLV. There were some blowouts in the games that were supposed to be the games of the week, like Missouri-Bama was so one-sided. But really, for the most part, what we got this week was a lot of almost upsets, like Texas at Vanderbilt, Nebraska at Ohio State, Penn State at Wisconsin, a bunch of really just almost so close games for contenders, and SMU at Duke, too. Went into overtime, they just missed the extra point. So entertainment nonetheless, but still maybe a little bit left to be desired in terms of actual consequential results. Coming in at number 11, we have Week 2. Now, this week is the best of the opening couple of weeks that had a lot of fluff, a lot of FCS games, a lot of lower tier matchups. And the reason I think this one was the best is because of the wild finishes we got. Oregon, Boise State was one of the games of the year. Arkansas, Oklahoma State was really fun and at the time thought to be pretty high stakes, at least for Oklahoma State. That ended up not being the case, but still fun in the moment. Iowa State, Iowa was super thrilling. Kansas State, Tulane was awesome. There was some really good stuff this week, but there were some of the big matchups that were a letdown, like Texas, Michigan wasn't very competitive. Tennessee, NC State wasn't competitive. Texas Tech, Washington State resulted in the Cougars just running away with it. So there were some big matchups people were hyping up this week. Colorado, Nebraska being another one that ended up just being pretty one-sided, which can still be entertaining, especially if the result is shocking to people, but definitely left a little bit to be desired, but still, like I said, the best of the opening couple weeks that featured a lot of FCS matchups and a lot of quote-unquote fluff. We are into the top 10, where at number 10, we have Week 12. Late into the season, there were some big-time matchups with pretty high stakes and definitely some games that completely reshaped the college football playoff field, like ASU beating Kansas State, Florida upsetting LSU, South Carolina escaping versus Missouri. Like, all these games were really, really exciting and interesting, but despite the big implications, some of the finishes weren't too wild. Like, Georgia pretty much controlled that game against Tennessee late. Texas controlled versus Arkansas. Arizona State even controlled the game against Kansas State, and Florida controlled the game versus LSU. So those ones were the ones where it was like you wish it could have just been a little bit closer at the end, so it was a little bit more of a tight finish. But we definitely got some of those. Like Missouri, South Carolina was really close down the wire. Kansas, BYU was closing down the wire. Even Oregon, Wisconsin was a 3-point game late into that one. So we definitely did get some of the thrilling, close, last-minute plays and games we wanted, but definitely there was a little bit more meat in the bone. We probably could have gotten a little bit more. Coming in at number 9, we have Week 8. This was right on the heels of a couple chaotic weeks, which if you've noticed are not on the list yet. They're going to be a little bit higher on here, but there was just some really high caliber football being played in the SEC. Some real urgency there. Georgia, Texas, Bama, Tennessee. Those were huge. I mean, Bama, Tennessee, in hindsight, that was a game for who's going to get a playoff spot out of those two. Tennessee wins, and they get it. There were theatrics in the ACC and the Big 12 this week. We saw Oklahoma State nearly take out BYU. We saw a close game between Miami and Louisville that was honestly one of the most hectic and insane games of the season, and just a lot of fun matchups across the country. And it was right at that midpoint in the season where we're really starting to learn if teams are contenders or pretenders. And like I said, a big factor for this one being all the way up at number 9 is it was right on the heels of a couple chaotic weeks. So this was kind of college football taking a deep breath and saying, all right, here we go. Let's test some of these contenders now after a couple of chaotic weeks. Coming in at number 8, we have Week 10. There were some massive swing games in this one, and this is a week, obviously, late into the season. Only 4 weeks of the regular season left to go after this one, and so some huge swing games. Games like Ohio State, Penn State. Games like Texas A&M, South Carolina, Louisville, Clemson, and there were some big upsets that really shook things up, and we also saw a fair amount of rivalries that ended up on this weekend, which really added to some of the fun. Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, just a few of the ones that are listed here at least, but definitely just some upsets that were crazy, like Louisville taking out Clemson, South Carolina dominating against Texas A&M, Texas Tech ending up taking out Iowa State in that one, Jacksonville State beating Liberty was huge for the CUSA and ended up determining who was in the conference title game. So definitely some really awesome stuff that happened in Week 10 that really shaped the landscape of college football. As we get to number 7, we're really starting to get into the territory of weeks that had very few flaws and were just awesome. And so like the awesome territory of weeks where I don't really have a ton of grudges against them. Like in week 11, we got the renewal of the Holy War. BYU versus Utah comes down to a last second field goal. There was Big 12 madness across the country as Iowa State goes on the road and gets smoked by Kansas. We see Colorado go into Lubbock and win a game. Indiana and Missouri both survived in just chaotic, crazy fashion. And then we saw some contenders not survive. Miami and Georgia both getting upset during this week. It was really chaotic. And if you've never seen the ending of the Louisiana Tech Jacksonville State game, you need to go watch that because that was an absolutely nuts finish that not enough people have seen. Coming in at number 6, we have Week 4, which was a really awesome week because it was the first week we got into conference play, and there were some big-time results that we had there, like TCU getting smoked by SMU in a non-conference rivalry game, USC opening up Big Ten play against Michigan and losing in a crazy close, crazy fun game. We saw Josh Heupel's return to Oklahoma for the Sooners' first SEC game. We saw Kansas State on the road versus BYU in what was a crazy night environment where BYU just ended up smoking Kansas State. Utah and Oklahoma State was thought to be, at the time, the biggest Big 12 game of the year, and so that one was really entertaining too. And that one kind of goes in line. There were some big-time results that may not have aged as well, but in a bottle, they were still really, really fun at the time. The other one is USC-Michigan. We thought that was like a top 10, top 15 matchup. It ends up not quite being that. We thought Oklahoma was a contender. They ended up not quite being that, but really that's not too big of a knock on it because it was all fun, and it was close finishes, and at the time, it was just really enjoyable. Coming in at number 5, we have Week 5, which is really aided by having the best game of the year, Georgia at Alabama. All eyes were on that game, and it literally delivered. It was the best game of the year, hands down. There were some ridiculously wild finishes. Like, there was that one. We saw the Kentucky-Ole Miss game, which was an insane collapse by Ole Miss. Louisville-Notre Dame was another classic, an early test for the Irish after they had already lost to NIU, and so they were in complete desperation mode there. We saw Virginia Tech-Miami come down to that Hail Mary. Like, there was just ridiculousness across the country. BYU Baylor was really entertaining too and ended up aging really well because Baylor ends up with this hot team at the end of the year. Arizona beating Utah was considered a shocking result at the time, and the Oklahoma State loss to Kansas State too was like, wow, Oklahoma State just totally got thrashed by Kansas State. Those two teams obviously ended up not being contenders in the Big 12, but we didn't necessarily know that at the time. There was a lot of speculation. Best game of the year this week, and just some awesome finishes. Coming in at number 4, we have Rivalry Week, Week 14, which is always going to go really high on this list. And it had the jaw-dropping results of the year, which was Michigan just spanking Ohio State out of nowhere and beating them 13-10 on the road. Like, that was one of those results that just left you wondering, how the heck did that happen? Some of the best games of the year were during this weekend. That was one of them. Georgia Tech versus Georgia, obviously, was cinema. It's not listed on here, but Clemson, South Carolina was another fantastic one. It was really entertaining across the country. I mean, seeing all these games, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Egg Bowl was entertaining. Notre Dame, USC was a fun one where the Irish had some late pick sixes to make it happen. And rivalry games are just always going to bring a certain level of juice. There were certainly ones that you wish you could have seen a little bit more, like Texas A&M, Texas. Yes, it was a charged, awesome environment, but Texas just controlled and dominated that game. And that was the case in a couple of those marquee matchups during rivalry weekend. And so as a result, I just thought that wasn't the strongest rivalry weekend we've seen, but still super awesome and always going to be great, regardless of what the results are, because of all of the rivalry stuff that's baked into it. Coming in at number 3, we have Week 13, the week before Rivalry Week. It felt like nobody was safe. It felt like everyone got caught looking ahead to their perceived biggest game of the season. Texas A&M goes on the road to play Auburn and gets shocked in overtime. Washington State loses the Pac-2 championship game to Oregon State, and the Beavs storm the field. BYU goes on the road to play ASU, gets shocked. It ruins their college football playoff hopes, and ASU storms the field not once, but twice. We watch Ole Miss's playoff hopes crumble on the road versus Florida. We watch Colorado's playoff hopes crumble at Kansas. We watched Iowa State narrowly keep their hopes alive by beating Utah with the last-second field goal. We finally saw Indiana get tested and get worked by Ohio State. Bama goes down on the road to Oklahoma. This one was just ridiculous. It flipped the entire college football playoff race on its head. We were having conversations about, could a one-loss Indiana get left out? And then that conversation immediately flipped to, okay, how many 3-loss teams could end up making it into this thing just because of how much pure chaos was happening in the sport? Coming in at number 2, we have Week 7. Week 7 was literally pure cinema from wire to wire. I remember from the morning slate to the afternoon slate to the evening slate, there were last-second touchdowns, there were overtime classics, there were field stormings. This was absolutely everything you could ever want on a college football Saturday. Florida takes Tennessee down to the wire and the Volunteers escape. LSU has a literal last-second walk-off touchdown on Ole Miss. South Carolina, Bama delivered a classic where the Tide just escaped with their lives. ASU upsets Utah and storms the field, which in hindsight wasn't necessarily an upset, but still a super fun result. Ohio State, Oregon, one of the games of the season where these two just juggernauts go at it and the Ducks eep it out. USC, Penn State goes to overtime. Kansas State uses an insane long bomb at the end there to beat Colorado. And then Purdue, Illinois, one of the most overlooked games of the season where Purdue randomly explodes, takes Illinois to overtime, and Illinois survives because that's just the type of season they were having versus Purdue. I mean, this was one of the best weekends of the entire season and just absolutely awesome. Coming in at number 1, we have Week 6. It's insane that the 2 best weeks of the season were back-to-back. And if you remember being in the midst of this saga from Week 6 to Week 7, it literally did not feel like real life. And I think this made this one of the best regular seasons we've had in a long time. There were several just flooring upsets in the SEC, like Vanderbilt beating Bama. I never thought I would see that, and it happened. Vanderbilt upset Alabama, and that was on the heels of them beating Georgia. Just ridiculous stuff. Arkansas upset undefeated Tennessee and stormed the field. We watched an overtime classic in Vegas between Syracuse and UNLV. We had the Coke versus Woke thing, which was one of the greatest game day slogans I can remember, and one of the greatest game days I can remember, where Cal got College Game Day and then played like out of their minds for 3 quarters of football, but then Miami storms an insane comeback to win and stay undefeated. Absolutely nuts. Minnesota beats a top 10 USC team and storms the field. Washington beats a top 10 Michigan team. SMU and Louisville were dueling in what ended up being a huge game in the ACC that had huge implications. There were other games like Wake Forest, NC State that I think get overlooked this week. There was just ridiculousness across the country, and this was the first true chaotic week of the season, and one you will not soon forget about. There are a few results that happened this week that I am convinced we will never see an upset of that magnitude again. Like the Alabama post-Saban era loss to Vanderbilt, that is something that will go in the history books. Week 6 was the best week of the college football season. That does it for this video. Feel free to let me know down in the comments, what was your favorite week of the regular season? Because this is kind of subjective, right? Like, it always depends on where you were, what games you watched, what results happened, you know, when you got the news, certain things happened, what game you were at can kind of dictate that sometimes. So let me know down in the comments what your own personal list is, maybe your top 3 weeks or top 1 week of the season if you don't want to bother remembering all of that. But if you enjoyed the video, make sure you're subscribed. A lot of you think you're subscribed and you're not. So just make sure you've hit that button and you are subscribed. We might hit 15,000 before the national championship game. Keep our fingers crossed. We're on the march for that right now. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed the content, there's more on the way. We're going to be making our college football playoff predictions later this week, and we got plenty more content on the way for you guys. So that's all I got for you guys, and I will see you guys next week.